Greetings indie game fans, welcome back to I Dream of Indie. This is Old Gamer Joe here with another review for you today. If it's your first time here at the channel, consider hitting that subscribe button below for tons of great indie reviews, previews, and more coverage. Today we're taking a look at Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story on the Nintendo Switch. This one comes from developers Suzaku and Hat Studios, and it's published by East Asia Soft. This horror adventure title is available as of January 7th of 2020 and will be priced at $19.99. The developers of this game cite some pretty interesting inspirations, including Clock Tower and Fatal Frame, rather niche horror games. I like both of those series quite a bit, however. So what happens when you combine gameplay elements from those titles, mix in some classic adventure gameplay, and then sprinkle a layer of cyberpunk on top? Well, you get Sense. But the question becomes, how successful is Sense in its execution? Well, let's get into it. Sense takes place in the year 2083 with the backdrop being Neo Hong Kong, and you'll play as lead character Mei Lin Mak, who's riding the subway into the downtown area towards the beginning of this game to meet up for a date. However, once she arrives, she's greeted with a pretty violent murder scene, and while most people might turn around at the sight of blood sprayed across the wall, Mei decides to press forward with her evening plans. I guess this is a very important date. As she awaits her date and is potentially stood up, she heads into the bathroom to freshen up. However, Mei realizes that something feels a bit off upon exiting said bathroom. Questioning if she's installed the wrong set of eyeballs, Mei soon finds herself caught up in a spirit-infested alternate universe of sorts that sets off an entirely different kind of story than you might have been expecting. While yes, that story does feel a little bit unexpected initially, I wouldn't say this is an overly complex narrative to digest, nor is the gameplay, which for the most part involves you interacting with and collecting different objects scattered across the game's world. Mei does carry with her a PDA device developed by Shiro Tech, and this allows her to access maps, journals, and view items that she's collected along the way. You do have full control over Mei, so in that regard, this game doesn't quite feel like a classic point-and-click adventure game per se, but it certainly does borrow some gameplay elements from that genre. There are interactive points, and they're easy enough for players to spot, and should you be in close proximity to two separate items of interest, the game does actually allow you to cycle through quite easily with the press of a button. So generally speaking, the core gameplay works something like this. Explore a new room, find a few items, and bring items to a new, typically pretty obvious destination in order to advance the story forward. While there is some light puzzle solving to be had here, I found most of the solutions in Sense to be pretty obvious, if I'm being real with you. So if you're looking for an adventure game chock full of mind-bending puzzles and thought-provoking solutions, this probably isn't going to be the one. Now, I don't really mean that as a negative though, as I personally didn't mind the overall pacing of Sense. I just want to make it clear that your first playthrough of the game isn't going to be too mentally taxing, which is totally fine with me. Occasionally, outside of the general exploration and item interaction, which there is plenty of, you will come across a physical puzzle of sorts where you'll have to manually figure things out, but for the most part you can expect tons of bringing item from point A to point B type solutions, and not a whole lot of variety. There are a few combat scenarios in this game and a quick time event or two, but they're not exactly staples of the gameplay, at least I wouldn't say they are. They come up from time to time, and then you do have a few chase segments where ghosts will kind of creep after you and you'll have to hide in a closet. I guess that's where the Clock Tower inspiration comes from. Again, these moments aren't super common, but they do help to shake things up a bit, even if, again, they aren't particularly difficult. Making the game even more manageable is a quick save feature, and this allows you to save the game at any given moment. The option actually, to be honest, kind of feels a little bit tacked on due to the fact that there are actual physical save locations in this title as well, which require an item similar to, say, Resident Evil with the ink ribbons, but they are welcome nonetheless. Nothing worse than losing a good chunk of gameplay because you either got caught by a ghost or the game tricks you into killing yourself, which yes, can happen and did happen to me from time to time. All in all, despite the lack of any real challenge in your first playthrough, Sense will take the average player, if I am the average player, which maybe I'm not, at any rate, about 7 hours or so to complete. And there is a pretty neat New Game Plus feature here for dedicated players. After all, you're going to want to get all those cosplays that Mei can unlock for herself. But on the whole, I did find the gameplay pretty accessible and entertaining, and the story worked well enough to hold my interest. If only then the game's performance on the Switch held its end of the bargain, because at times Sense can feel a bit of a technical mess. Crossing between hallways almost always treats players to a brutally long load screen, which can honestly feel like an eternity given the game's slow and brooding pace and the fact that you do have to switch between hallways quite frequently in this title. Even worse are some horrendous frame rate issues where, depending on the room, you can expect to dip down into the single digits. As my game jittered and slowed to a crawl in more graphically intense areas, I guess you could call them, I began to lose my patience. So in reality, that 7 hours of pure gameplay could actually become more like 10 physical hours with this game, just due to all of the performance issues in the Switch version. Worse yet, I did experience one outright crash, which thankfully didn't set me back too far thanks to that autosave feature and the ability to quick save, but it was annoying nonetheless. It's a bit of a shame really, because graphically I quite like the look of Sense. The neon-soaked streets are vibrant and beautiful to explore. I think the contrast between the characters and the 3D backgrounds looks great, and while most of the game takes place in dark apartment corridors, the lighting was pretty good generally, helped by your ability to use a flashlight. The game does a really good job of creating a heavy atmosphere and fusing in some neat cyberpunk flair, so overall, I was a fan of this aesthetic despite a disappointing performance on the Switch. And as far as the handheld mode goes, if you want to play this one undocked, I didn't come across anything noticeably worse than playing the game docked, and the game looks pretty nice on handheld, but do keep in mind the majority of my gameplay was docked. As far as the sound design goes here, Sense has some pretty nice synth tracks that ooze a lot of style, as well as some solid atmospheric tones. These compositions work well to give the game an additional layer of atmosphere, and I overall enjoyed all of the music that I came across. I think in general the sound design is pretty strong here. May will yell out the occasional voice dialogue as well, and so will some of the ghosts that you come across, but generally speaking there's not a ton of voice acting. What's here is fairly decent, I would say, but overall Sense sounds pretty great. It's honestly a bit frustrating that Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story, has the performance issues that it does, but I do think it says something about this game that I was willing to continually deal with them in order to see it through. I more or less enjoyed the story, I like the visual aspects of the game, and I found the gameplay itself and the sound design to generally be well implemented. While the endless barrage of load screens and frame rate drops haunted me throughout my adventure, I still ultimately think there are enough positive elements to this game that make it worth a look, especially if you are a fan of niche horror.